So to finish this section and to learn a bit more about data mutations with Next.js, I want to make this like button here work so that for a given post I can click it and, well, this post will get marked as liked by me. Now for that in the database, I actually already got a likes table that is set up when the database file is created, where I'll in the end store a user ID, post ID combination, so that every user can like every post exactly once. And of course, they can also unlike it. Now, when selecting all posts, I got some query in there where in the end I find out whether a post is being liked by a specific user by checking whether the user with their ID likes a post with a given ID. And here I always assume that it's the user with ID 2 because I can't make that user specific at this point because we got no way of switching users or logging in with users. That's why in this section we assumed that posts are always created by a user with ID 1 and vice versa. I always assume that it's always the user with the ID 2 that may be liking a post here, so that it's a different user that's now logged in that can view the posts and that can like the posts. That's why this is hard-coded like this here. As mentioned multiple times, later you will learn how to actually work with users and how to log in and so on. But that's the logic here. And in the end here, I then create a new isLiked property on the retrieved data that is either true or false in the end, depending on whether a given user has created a like entry in that likes table for a given post. And those like entries are created or removed with help of this update post like status function here, where I find out whether a given user with a given ID, which will be ID 2 here in this application, is liking a post or not. So whether a user has an entry in that likes table or not. And if they don't have one, I insert one. If they did have one, I delete it whenever this button is pressed. That's the plan. Now, to bring that plan to life, we of course have to bring that button to life. And for that, we should go to that posts.js file in the components folder where I have a posts component because it's in there where I'm outputting my post items and where I have this like button. And the goal now is to make sure that whenever the like button is pressed, we actually trigger some code that creates a new post user ID entry in the likes table or removes it with help of this update post like status function I just showed you. Now, how can we make this work? Well, we can make it work with help of a new server action, because in the end, when that button is pressed, we also want to submit some data to the server and we want to update the database. So again, it's in the end another form submission we're dealing with here. Therefore, we could create a server action here or do it in that separate actions file which we created earlier, and that's indeed what I'll do here. So in that actions folder in the posts.js file there, I'll export a new async function called toggle post like status. And I expect to get the ID of the post for which I want to change the like status. And I then want to call this update post like status function. So this function which will update the database. Now this function wants a post ID and a user ID. And as I mentioned before, here I'll hard code the user ID to 2. So to that user with the ID 2. But of course, the post ID should be the post ID we're receiving as an argument here. And that's then essentially all. Back in the post component here, I therefore now want to trigger that server action that we just added whenever this like button is pressed. And there are two ways of doing that. One way of doing it would be to go to the actual button element, which is defined in the like button. And it turns out that there you can indeed set a form action prop, which also accepts such a form action as a value. So we could accept this action as an input here and bind that to this button. And then in the post component, we could pass the action prop to the like button, and the value I want to pass here should of course be that toggle post like status action we just worked on, which therefore is imported from that actions folder and the posts file there. That would be one way of making it work, because you can not just use server actions as a value for the action prop on a form, but also instead as a value for the form action prop on a button. That's one way of using them. However, that's not what I'll do here, even though it would work fine. Instead, I'll simply wrap this like button with a form here, because there's nothing wrong with doing that. And I'll then set this action prop directly here on the form. So that's in the end the same approach I used for the new post page form. With that, whenever this button is pressed, it will be this action, this function that will be triggered. Now, theoretically, that's all we need to do. However, if we save everything and I reload here and I click this button, it stays in that unliked mode. Now, to some extent, that makes sense because we haven't added any logic here anywhere in our markup that would change the appearance of that button or of that icon in that button, depending on whether the post is liked or not. So we should change that. And we can change that by adding a class here, a CSS class to that form or to that div, doesn't matter, but it should be on some parent element of this like button. And here I want to add a class conditionally based on whether that post is liked or not. And this is liked property will exist on the posts that are retrieved from the database, because in my code where I am retrieving posts from the database, I do define this is liked property based on whether the user with the ID 2 does like that post or not. So this is liked property exists, and it will be true if the user does like that post and false otherwise. So if the post is liked, I want to add a class of liked to that form element, and otherwise I won't add any class. And in the global styles that were part of the starting project, there is a rule that makes the button change its appearance if it is inside of an element that has the liked class. So with that, if I save that and reload this page, we still don't see anything. Well, we can't see anything here because you must keep in mind that the toggle post like status function here wants a post ID, which it then forwards to update post like status. However, at the moment, I'm using it as an action for this form, and therefore what does it get? It gets such a form data object, not the post ID. Therefore, what we need to do here, and what Next.js and React allow us to do, is we must add some extra data that will be submitted to that function when it's triggered by React. And we can do this by calling the bind method on that function object. Now that's a standard JavaScript method you can call on function objects to, you could say, pre-configure that function, to define some values that will be passed to the function in the future when it's executed. Bind then takes two arguments. The first one defines what the this keyword inside of this function will refer to, and that doesn't matter to us here, therefore I'll just set it to null. But the second argument you pass to bind will then become the new first argument when that function is eventually executed in the future. And in my case here, that should be the post ID. So that's a way of pre-configuring which data will be passed to this function in the future when it's executed by React. Now, if you would still need to get access to the form data, you could still do that by simply accepting it as a second argument here. So any arguments you bind with help of the bind method will be provided as first arguments, and then the default arguments, which would have received otherwise, will come thereafter. But here I don't need the form data, so I'll just ignore it. But with that, we'll now pass that post ID to this toggle post like status server action, and therefore now indeed that user ID like combination should be stored. So again, if you save everything and you reload, if you click here, nothing happens. But now, if you reload the page, this should be marked as liked, and this should prove that indeed the user did like this item here. It just doesn't update instantly. The same is true for unliking it. If I click this, which I did, it stays in that liked mode until I reload. And that's of course not the best user experience. So what can we do about it?